Good evening, everyone. I feel like everyone in this room knows each other. It's really, there's an energy. My name's RJ McGill. Welcome to the American Academy. I am the head of communications here at the Academy and the editor of our Berlin Journal. Thanks for joining us tonight for the Ellen Maria Garrison Lecture, Sound in Multidisciplinary Collaboration by our fellow David Grubbs. I will say just a brief word about the fellowship and introduce David's introducer and then hand the floor over to him. The Ellen Maria Garrison Fellowship is named after the elder daughter of Hans Arnold, in whose house we are right now, our erstwhile house. Born in 1916, she spent her teenage years in this house. She went on to become a journalist and one of the earliest proponents of the European Union and the United Nations, backed by no other than Eleanor Roosevelt. She's a remarkable figure. You can't sum up someone's life in a brief introduction. She's a super fascinating person. And this name fellowship was established by her daughter, the late Nina von Malzahn, who is one of the Academy's most legendary benefactors, and she passed away in May 2022. Tonight, David will be introduced by artist and electronic music composer Jan St. Werner, about whom I'll just say a few words. Werner is co-founder of the electronic duo Mouse on Mars. In the mid-1990s, he was part of the Cologne collective A Music. I guess they like the name of them. He collaborated with Marcus Popp as Microstoria, and he developed music for the artist Rosa Barba, who is also here in the audience tonight. He has realized sound interventions and exhibitions in art spaces such as the Staatliche Kunsthalle Baden-Baden, the Lenbach House in Munich, the HKW here in Berlin, Documentary 14, Athens and Kassel, and the ICA in London, among others. Werner has been a visiting lecturer at MIT and was a professor at the Academy of the Fine Arts Nuremberg, Fine Arts School of Art. What is it called?
Yeah, whatever, like arts.
Sounds good. It's a strange formulation here at Art School in Nuremberg. From 2017 to 2021. And there, with the sound and space artist Michael Axthaler, he initiated the Class for Dynamic Acoustic Research, or DAF, in 2017, which today operates as an independent collective. Werner has also written music for ensembles and orchestras, German public radio, and produced installations for dozens of galleries and museums. And finally, if you happen to have visited this year's 60th Biennale in Venice, in which Werner was one of the artists representing Germany, you may have seen his installation, Volumes Inverted, which is a loudspeaker instrument designed specifically for the monastic ruin on the island of Lecetosa, in dialogue with another loudspeaker hundreds of meters away across the lagoon, creating an interlocking sonic interexchange. I wish you could set that up here and across the other side of Wannsee, and we could experience it directly. It sounds... It is a question of budget. We're looking for donors. Should any of you be watching out there, the night will work like this. David will come up and speak here for about 35 minutes, and then he and Jan will go on stage. Jan will have a short discussion with him, open it up to the floor for a few questions. If you're in the room, please raise your hand and a microphone will come around to you. If you're joining us via the live stream, type your questions into the chat. And at the end, there is a speaker there and an instrument that will be used by David. I don't know what's going to happen on them, but that will be happening. And with that, Jan, the floor is yours.
So, good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be introducing my good friend David Grubbs, who I have met in the late 90s without expecting to be so closely affiliated over decades. Although I seem to know him very well, I will read his biography because it is much too diverse for my very simple brain to remember. David Grubbs is a distinguished professor of music at Brooklyn College and Graduate Center, CUNY. He is the author of Good Night, The Pleasure Was Ours, which is like, this is reversed in time. I would start with Records Ruin the Landscape, which is the first book in the series, followed by Now That the Audience is Assembled, then The Voice in the Headphones, and then Good Night, The Pleasure Is Ours. That would be chronologically right, at least to my sense. All of those books have been published by Duke University Press. He also did the collaborative artist book Simultaneous Soloists with the great Anthony McCall, that appeared or was published by Pioneer Works Press, and then Projectile, great cover by Marco Fusinato, noise guitarist, which he produced with Rito Geiser and John Sparagana. Do I pronounce the name right? Okay, cool. So that book was published by Drag City, the label that also publishes most of David's records. And Records Ruin the Landscape, just a short footnote, has appeared in French, Italian, and Japanese translations. We're working on a German translation right now, and an Austrian and a Swiss version. Grubbs has released 15 solo albums. I doubt that number. I think there have been far more than these, but this is probably what you would still get without paying ridiculous prices on black markets. So those 15 albums have been, amongst others, The Spectrum Between, which was also released on Drag City, great Chicago label. That, by the way, was album of the year in the London Sunday Times. It was definitely album of the decade for me and a lot of friends of mine. He's known for his cross-disciplinary collaborations with, for instance, poet Susan Howe, who he'll talk about today, Anthony McCall, who we already mentioned, Angela Bullock, who's also here tonight. Don't miss bragging her about what it's really like to collaborate with David Grubbs. Josiah McElhenney, who is also here. Also, please find him and ask him how is David really? And then, what else to say? His work has been presented at, among other venues, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the MoMA, Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou, Planet Mars, all these big venues. Grubbs was a member of the group Scasso del Sol, which is one of my most favorite groups ever. Basto, Squirrel Bait, I was much too young to listen to those bands. He has performed with Tony Conrad. I'm a huge fan of Tony Conrad's work. He's one of the most amazing, unfortunately not living American artists anymore, amongst Ayan Amache, who I keep mentioning whenever I can. The Duff Collective, who has been mentioned here earlier, is doing a great 24-hour performance at the DRD Gallery next weekend, but that's not in David's biography. I'm just improvising. Another collaborator was Pauline Oliveros, also famous American composer. Luc Ferrari, whose wife was part of this beautiful documentary that Luke Fowler presented last night at Rosa Barber Studio. If you already had enough cross-references and affiliations between artists, he also collaborated with Will Oldham, who recently performed in Berlin, Lauren Connors, me, the Red Crayola, and many others. Anyway, this will be part of the lecture tonight, or the talk tonight. How does he do it? How is it even possible to collaborate and still remain the one and only David Grubbs? He's also a recipient of the Berlin Prize and the Foundation for Contemporary Arts Award in Music and Sound, a member of the board of directors of Blank Forms, great arts organization based in New York, and director of the Blue Chopsticks record label, one of the most amazing independent experimental music labels out there. And I think, David, that's what my job was, yes. Right?
All right. Thank you, Jan. I also want to begin with my sincere thanks to the entirety of the staff of the American Academy in Berlin for making the past 3 months an absolute dream and facilitating both the best work environment that one could imagine while also assiduously and creatively maintaining connections to Berlin and all its vibrancy. I want to thank the generous donors who funded the Ellen Maria Gorison Fellowship. And I also want to give an equally sincere thanks and shout out to the fall 2024 class of fellows, Peter, Isa, Jim, Michael, Ayana, Nell, Zach, Mona, Max, and Amy, as well as their partners and families, whom I've learned so much from and alongside, and who have been such an incredible pleasure to live among and to spend time with on a daily basis. So the talk today, as you can see, now has a title beyond the placeholder title, Sound and Multidisciplinary Collaboration. The title is Where You Leave Off and I Begin. And in the talk tonight, I'll be talking about preliminary collaborations with Susan Howe and Anthony McCall. One of my jobs for the last 2 decades has been teaching collaborative art making, and little of what I've learned strikes me as broadly generalizable. Each effort, each combination of artists, thankfully, bristles with its own specificity. And so my preferred approach to writing about working collaboratively is through close description of individual projects and the dynamics of collaborative relationships in the time of their unfolding. What prepared me to teach collaboration? From an early age, there was playing in bands, and then with sympathetic foils trying out something other than the model of the band. There was performing music in improvised settings, generally with fleeting or never to be repeated combinations of players. There was working with visual artists under the umbrella of a music group dropped into the less charted, more negotiable framework of contemporary art, and subsequently working with artists outside of predominantly musical contexts to create sound compositions for film, video, sculpture, and installation. There was toggling between, but also combining, working to hybridize spaces of performance and exhibition. There was teaming up with writer friends with a definite predilection for poets to create recordings and performances. And finally, there was teaching collaboration collaboratively, teaching alongside others while students craft co-authored performance works is where I learned most of what I know about teaching. And one through line to underscore in these interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary settings is that music and sound emerge as a productive meeting ground, and what follows in part is an investigation into sound as a privileged locus for collaboration. So perhaps the fundamental question, why are practices that we group together under the rubric of sound especially welcoming to collaborators from diverse disciplinary backgrounds? In narrating my own ongoing collaborative relationships, I tend to zoom in on details from first meetings or preliminary conversations. I often have the feeling that no matter how long I've been working with someone, that we continue to pursue the consequences of a first conversation, following threads and developing themes that have been present from the start. The intensity accorded to preliminary meetings, or as a musician, first opportunities to perform together, nominates even seemingly incidental details or sensation, everything that burns into memory as shared repertoire. So this is a short excerpt that we'll listen to now from Frolic Architecture, a 2011 collaboration with Susan Howe.
Nent the dirt own osier a land and a sia ned in one. No sun, nor did the waxen, yet did the year the circumam ed her arms alone, oh, though there it could tread, air was dark, and all objects, wild things strove. Labored after an awakening, was leaning. Embody my body slipping, embody my body slipping down full toward its own secret sermon, secret sermon, rough of ground, scent, secret a mist, and I, sermon, dur, el. That be at rest, more sure, these alu shadow long shall, finding no, but find a bewildered ever, weary of my head, that is first, then was ever, for they ever had.
When I first met Susan Howe, we'd been tasked with creating performance works based on her poetry, and she was kind enough to make the trek from her home in Guilford, Connecticut, to my apartment in Brooklyn. The fundamental question that I needed to answer was, why add music or sound to Susan's work, which is already sonic? In that first conversation, we needed to strategize about a performance that would be something other than a poetry reading with musical accompaniment. We sought to avoid a clear demarcation of foreground and background, and of music or sound composition inevitably cast in a supporting role. Our conversation turned to experiences we'd had in which, as a listener, one felt alive to an art of sound distinct from music. The first example Susan named as meaningfully occupying this nexus were the sculptor Carl Andre's poems and Agnes Martin's paintings that incorporate a single word of text. I noted that the examples that she offered regarding works that successfully engaged the sonic didn't themselves require being sounded. The next example she alighted upon, and the one that seemed most apropos of our task, was a reading by John Cage that Susan had seen at the St. Mark's Poetry Project's annual New Year's Day marathon in 1976. At that event, Cage read excerpts from Miro, a Masastic work based on the journals of Henry David Thoreau, to an extraordinary hush in the midst of what throughout the day had been an intermittently carnivalesque atmosphere. Cage's reading made a profound impression on her in its nuance, in its alien musicality, in what it asked of its audience, and in how the audience responded with an attentiveness to every word, as well as to Cage's vocalizations of isolated vowels and consonant clusters and the, at times, lengthy silences between utterances. Cage's reading at its slowest was an ostentatious lugubriousness, suggestive of audio tape crawling to a near halt, the voice resolving into a hum. Through an exercise of attention to an uncommon degree, the audience draws close. As a performer, Cage's reading was impossible and unnecessary to classify as music or literature or theater. Susan didn't hesitate to describe it as one of the finest readings she'd ever seen or heard. When I first met Anthony McCall in his studio on J Street in Tribeca, it was because he had switched from making 16mm films, in which the whir of the projector in the space of presentation provides aural accompaniment, to using digital projection, which is almost entirely inaudible. At the time, he had only recently returned to making artworks after a gap of 20 years, and the relative silence of digital projection was a novel, arresting aspect of a new suite of works. After the harsh mechanical thrum of the 16mm pieces, many of which use multiple projectors, the slow, soundless sweep of light in the new pieces felt like elegance itself. But it was clear at that first meeting that the clock had been ticking and that for some time he'd been thinking about confronting the issue of sound. I remember that he referred to it as the problem of sound. I soon became aware that Anthony typically has a mechanical pencil in hand and inclines towards rapid sketches as part of the process of brainstorming. Here's a drawing that we discussed in that first conversation. The fundamental aspect of this drawing is a symmetrical and inverse relationship between image and sound, the latter specified as horns. Note that in this sketch of a composition, the fundamental action is that an image disappears and is replaced by sound. Image and sound are pictured as being in a compensatory relationship, and I'd never thought of the two in terms of reciprocity. Like many people, I became acquainted with Anthony's solid light works through the inclusion of his 1973 film Line Describing a Cone in the Whitney Museum's 2001 exhibition Into the Light, the Projected Image in American Art, 1964 to 1977. For many, the revelation of the show was the installation of McCall's film in its own hazed-up room, a silent film accompanied by the not insignificant sound of the projector in the space. If one were to watch the two-dimensional image of Line Describing a Cone on a flat projection surface, what happens is this. A white dot appears on a black background. It starts to elongate and slowly traces what's eventually legible as the drawing of a white circle on a black background, with the arc proceeding in a clockwise direction and the rate of motion consistent throughout. At the end of 30 minutes, the circle is completed and the film ends. One of the first things to underscore about McCall's solid light pieces is that you're unlikely to spend much time watching the two-dimensional image on a projection surface. Instead, the experience of the work will likely have more to do with the three-dimensional sculptural volume of light that's picked up through the medium of haze, hence the transition in the simplest and most foundational of his solid light works from 2 to 3 dimensions, from circle to cone. If Line Describing a Cone presents the growth and completion of a cone of light over the course of the work's duration, the series that he had begun to envision would start with a complete figure and then enact its disappearance. The proposed series had a quietly elegiac title, Leaving. My first questions to Anthony had to do with time structure. Was he contemplating a piece that would be viewed in its entirety by a crowd assembled for that purpose? Or would it be encountered in loop mode in the space of an exhibition and with less likelihood that the compositional structure would be experienced as such? Were we talking about viewers or visitors? And where were we, roughly speaking, on a continuum in which at one end you'd find something that reads as music and at the other, sound composition? Anthony surprised me by being less concerned with the selection and character of sound materials, or even, at least at first, how the sound might function vis-a-vis the category of music, than with the effect of the sound composition on the behavior of visitors. He understood the rate of change in the visual composition to be crucial for how it encourages or discourages spectators' movement throughout the space. Now, it's a commonplace with Anthony's solid light work to speak of it simultaneously as cinema and sculpture. Historically, it emerges from his filmmaking, but the three-dimensional volume of light with which viewers engage is fundamentally sculptural. He crystallized his line of thinking with a memorable formulation, and I remember him delivering it slowly and steadily, much as a lecturer taps the brakes to prepare listeners for a tricky figure of speech. His observation was that if an image moves faster than the viewer, it's cinema. But if the viewer moves faster than an image, it's sculpture. This aphoristic claim had a ring of truth about it, but how would it function with regard to sound? Before we concluded our first meeting, I proposed to Susan that I record her reading. She chose her long poems Thoreau and Melville's Marginalia, and together these were to become the two halves of our first performance work. On Thoreau's penultimate page spread, verso and recto pages are identical, but with the recto page flipped. Each page contains text that's right side up, upside down, and skewed at a variety of angles. Having known Thoreau for several years before working with Susan on the piece, I I had assumed that a salient feature of these and similar pages was that one finds a different path through the tangle of lines with each reading. I still think that's true for the individual reader. One is unlikely to settle upon a single determinate method for how to read these pages, and the sequence in which one encounters its component parts remains in flux. That's part of the appeal, I think. I was fascinated, however, to discover upon hearing Susan read this on numerous occasions that she has a clear method for making her way through these pages, and that what I'd presumed to be some species of indeterminate score functions otherwise in her reading. When embarking upon a piece with Susan, I begin by familiarizing myself as best as I can with the printed version of the text. But once I've recorded her reading of the poem, and that's how the process has started for each project over the last 20 years, I set aside the written text, and for my purposes, the recorded version becomes definitive. Stepping away from the text allows me to listen with greater intensity of focus, to encounter the poem differently, and to attend more fully to the sonic dimensions of the work. Susan's performance in all of its purposefulness becomes the spine of the composition. I need to learn the rhythms and the tempos of her reading. I need to learn the emphases that shade her vocalizing, details in her handling of the poem that wouldn't be evident to a reader, and I need to be able to map the range of intensities in her transformation of printed text into flow of acoustic events. Once I had the recording of Susan reading Thoreau, I started with the third and final section. This section. I cut the recording into a collection of lines and then individual words. I kept cutting, compiling syllables and stray consonants, sometimes shaping fragments into smooth, isolable objects, and sometimes making the roughness of the cut perfectly apparent. Just as the penultimate page spread of Thoreau features textual superimpositions, I overlaid Susan's performances of that final section with a welter of fragments from the gamut that I had assembled. I scattered. First, I scattered by ear, what sounded best with what, which clusters had the greatest impact, and then I scattered by eye. In the edit window of the digital audio workstation, I learned to trust my visual apprehension, placing audio clips by sight and only periodically listening to the results. Rather than using the computer as a real-time musical instrument, I approached the software as a tool for collage. It was a slow, involving, repetitive, occasionally meditative process of placing tiny sonic elements, of scattering with deliberation and deliberateness. In the final version of the piece, it's difficult to tell which pops and snaps and violent interruptions were created in my editing and recomposing, and which ones occurred in that first performance in my living room. I typically have a method in mind and an end in sight when I begin to work on a piece, and this was one of the rare, cherished occasions, one of those instructive instances in which I truly did not. After a period of working with Susan's voice exclusively, my impulse that everything should be generated from her reading had started to seem showy, as if my purpose were to demonstrate how much could be done with how little material. Susan and I had talked about Charles Ives, and especially his Piano Sonata No. 2, also known as the Concord Sonata. It's in 4 movements with a fourth titled Thoreau. Near the end of the Thoreau movement, there's a brief, famously unexpected flute part that's meant to represent Thoreau playing his instrument by the edge of Walden Pond. As Charles Ives wrote, quote, "Thoreau was a great musician, not because he played the flute, but because he didn't have to go to Boston to hear the symphony." This prompted me to ask the Swedish reed player Mats Gustafsson to record variations on the flute theme from Ives' Thoreau on the flutophone, an instrument that Mats created by jamming a saxophone mouthpiece into the body of a flute. And in Bartleby the Scrivener, Melville describes Bartleby's voice as quick and flute-like, and that's the quality that I desired. When the eruptive squall of language in the final section abates, when storm clouds separate, the text announces, quote, "You are of me, and I of you. I cannot tell where you leave off and I begin." Let's pause there. I cannot tell where you leave off and I begin. This disorienting quality of not being able to identify the source of a voice is something that Susan and I were eager to explore in performance. During sound checks, one litmus test was whether, with eyes closed, I could tell whether I was listening to Susan's reading or to recordings of her voice, and creating as seamless as possible a blending of the two, or three, or four, or five was a desired effect. I wanted to hear multiple Susans and not a clear-cut duet between human Susan and robot or cyborg Susan. My attraction to a confusion of voices originates in her techniques for performing the cuts in her own poetry, those fascinating self-interruptions operating on a continuum between language and sonic abstraction, the smallest jab of sound, some of my favorite music. Anthony McCall and I first met to discuss the incorporation of sound into his Solid Light works in 2007, but it wasn't until after 2 years of regular meetings that we completed and locked down a piece, and then set it aside. In his drawing for the piece with the working title Leaving that he shared in our first meeting, one sound that he had imagined was a massing of horns, because the projection in Anthony's Solid Light pieces cuts through the haze much as a lighthouse's beam cuts through fog. Foghorns or related technologies seemed a promising starting point. I started to work on strange composite creatures that ideally registered as horns but exuded a character all their own. These combined electronic sound from an analog synthesizer with manipulated recordings of foghorns and were then processed using a plate reverb. Anthony had suggested a gathering of multiple horns, so I created 5 distinct entities, each with their own fundamental pitch, as well as slight microtonal variations. Each of these 5 horns was reproduced by its own dedicated loudspeaker, and I got hung up on this strange idea that this counterintuitive idea of a speaker as an entity that's able to produce one sound and one sound only. When listening to the soundtrack in a space ringed by the 5 speakers, the gradual increase in volume of the 5 horns brought to mind 5 ships slowly converging and exiting together. After a single listening session, Anthony and I agreed that our realization of the schema did not work. Why didn't we regard ours as a successful working out of this idea? The sound composition for this first never exhibited attempt at Leaving registered to us foremost as music. 5 sounds on 5 speakers ringing in exhibition space grow in volume from the threshold of audibility to being hugely loud over the course of 30 minutes and then fade out over the course of 5 minutes, ultimately converging, as you can see, in a single speaker. My impression once we'd finally set it up was that it didn't offer a meaningful counterweight to Anthony's Solid Light composition. There was sufficiently little commonality among the visual and the aural for the viewer to sense a transfer or a crossover from one to the other. The symmetry of the schema was lost, in part because looking and listening are rarely experienced in isolation, and what I recall is time spent looking at loudspeakers, which is to say, impatiently looking at loudspeakers. Anthony next suggested that we try recording the foghorn on Governor's Island, just a short trip across the water from the southern tip of Manhattan. Negotiations ensued. This is a very long story. I've shortened it considerably. And in the end, the Coast Guard agreed to sound the foghorn for a total of 10 minutes. And so there we were with our portable recording equipment on a cold fall morning on a sailboat in New York Harbor. The harbor greeted us with its complex soundscape, notable for a nearly continuous texture of helicopters overhead, rich New Yorkers getting a jump on the weekend, and a number of weathered, undeniably picturesque bell buoys, floating fog bells, audible from multiple locations throughout the harbor. At almost exactly the prescribed time, a small Coast Guard motorboat went zipping past us and docked at the northwest corner of Governor's Island next to a metal structure that resembled a walk-in freezer. A sprightly figure in a navy blue jumpsuit hopped out of the boat and turned what in the distance looked like a large key, like somebody winding a giant music box. We braced ourselves for the force of the horn. There was an expectant pause, and then it went, meep. A pathetic meep. A rasping bleat closer to the horn of a Ford Model T than the blast of the QE2. That was the end of foghorns and leaving, but the bell buoys we encountered that morning had already suggested a new approach. When reviewing the sailboat recording several weeks later, we agreed that the most captivating stretches were those that, in contrast to the anticipated main event of the foghorn, had seemed nearly empty. These were, of course, not at all empty, but instead characterized by a busy weave of hushed, at times extremely subtle sonic activity. With these recordings, we saw how we might aurally represent an experience of distance. After spending time with the recordings we'd made in New York Harbor, Anthony proposed that we document a similarly complex texture of traffic sound. And so late one morning, we took a hike north from his studio to the entrance of the Holland Tunnel. And so we had a breakthrough after 3 years, when at the outset, Anthony referred to the problem of sound. The drama of his formulation piqued my interest. I understood that he experienced sound as an issue that would eventually need to be solved, but I also assumed that this was something that we'd resolve in relatively short order, and instead, I was the one who came to feel the prophetic weight of the word problem. It had been Anthony's problem, then it was our problem, and the more time passed, the more I felt it to be my problem. When the nuke completed, leaving with 2-minute silence, which I think some of you have seen exhibited at the Hamburger Bahnhof, when it was first exhibited at the Sean Kelly Gallery in New York, visitors upon entering were met with a quiet texture of densely buzzing activity that from a distance resembled white noise. It was only by moving toward one or the other of the speakers that were embedded in two opposing walls, approximately 35 feet apart, that one could really bring into focus the otherwise indistinct sound material. You needed to actively seek it out. It was crucial to the piece that there would be no spot in which one would have an all-over perspective on the sound. The gallery was located on 10th Avenue in Manhattan, and the speaker embedded in the west wall contained recordings from New York Harbor, while the speaker in the east wall played those we'd made near the mouth of the Holland Tunnel. It was as if the walls had dematerialized, and the gallery were exposed on one side to the sounds of 10th Avenue and the other to those of the Hudson River. It would never have occurred to me at the beginning of the process that Anthony would install the sound with any suggestion of aural illusion. For the solid light component of Leaving with 2-minute silence, Anthony created a cyclical 32-minute composition in which two horizontal projections are placed side by side, one waxing and the other waning. Rather than merely presenting the disappearance of an image, the work simultaneously enacts appearance and disappearance in a compensatory relationship, but this time between two visual forms. Where we had previously experimented with replacing a visual form with a sonic one, here the process of displacement moved from one visual form to the other. The referential character of sound in Leaving with 2-minute silence marked a shift in Anthony's work that we've continued to explore in subsequent pieces. Because of the lengthy process that preceded it, I found that I was able to answer more or less the same question that struck me when first meeting Susan Howe, namely, why add sound to this work? In both cases, sound became the ground on which much of the collaboration occurred, and Susan's and Anthony's hands-on approaches would increasingly become a standard by which I assessed future collaborations. What I've gained in time spent with the both of them counts among the most rigorous and generative lessons in working with sound I've learned from anyone, whether or not their business card reads composer. Thank you.
scene, scene 3. No, scene 4. Excuse me, RJ. So, David, it's hard to ask you a question after like all this input. I had prepared a question. I will refer to it or get like wind back to it. I'm a bit taken away by the presentation. I like lived through the struggles and enjoyed the successes that you had. But let me like maybe add to the biography of yours that I just read. That today I spoke to Josiah McGallany about you, and he said like David is the most organized person I know. And I said, yes, you can throw so much chaos at him and it comes out like somehow organized. The thing is, the form of organization doesn't resemble anything that is symmetrical. It seems to be a very quick process of a talent or an ability or a quality of like assigning things according to their nature or their tendency. So you have a way of compiling sometimes very abstract ideas, inputs, problems, sometimes very concrete ones, the ones you face when you tour with a band or you work with other musicians or artists who are stubborn or like know exactly what they want but cannot formulate it. And you have this ability of like kind of feeling out or like seeing what is behind the intention, and then you have an ability of grouping things. You're suggesting an order. You're not like, this is how we do it. I see a symmetry. I see a structure. I see what you want to do. You're like, I feel like this refers to this and this kind of belongs to that. So this is a long introduction to my question, which is like, I would say you're an artist who comes from experience, but you're able to formalize, you're able to systemize. And that also leads you to being a great, I would say, like a great teacher. I know that because I've taught together with David in various occasions, collaboratively. That's maybe something that might pop up at some point, but just like certifying my it's not an assumption, my thesis, that you're able to do that. So coming from experience and being a performing musician or being a productive artist, and then formalizing, conceptualizing, and transcending into, let's say, pedagogy or like whatever teaching. When did that process? When did you become? Have you ever become aware of the process? It is in act.
Yeah, I feel like in my own experience, teaching is the thing that formalizes that process, because otherwise, I think that I'm not very good at pattern recognition. And
you have a bad sense of orientation.
I have a terrible sense of orientation. Yeah, terrible sense of direction. But it's interesting that you experience me as being able to like assess chaos or like a welter of ideas and suggest a kind of, I don't know, emerging categories or relation between some of the ideas. When I mean, with this project, the first observation was that in 20 or so years of teaching collaborative art making, I feel that there's very little that emerges in the way of general ideas from it, and that it's really this kind of inductive relationship to thinking about each collaboration in all of its specificity that seems meaningful to me. I will say, I think also that you were asking like where this ability to organize the chaos comes from. I kind of feel like it comes out in conversation. So Josiah McElhaney's in the audience right here, and I composed soundtracks for 7 pieces in a recent exhibition of his in Chicago. And we've been working and discussing, and I've been making drafts of things and bringing them to Josiah's studio for the two of us to listen to and discuss. And the turning point in the process was a moment where Josiah said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said something like, well, what's the correlative of my process in what you're doing? And I think that the two that I'd been proceeding by a kind of like very inductive, organic, feeling my way through the process. And Josiah kind of like asked me, to really like explain like why the selection of materials, why the organization in this way, and is there a correlative in the sound composition to his visual art? And so, yeah, I feel like it comes about in conversation, because maybe I wouldn't otherwise recognize those sorts of emerging categories all by my lonesome.
May I add that you are a great improviser as well? So as much as you're like not the best pathfinder, you are very good in dealing with like what comes your way. So is that part of that ability or process of like working with other artists, or channeling in like knowledge?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I would underscore is the kind of like years long or decades long arc in which one develops these skills. Because for years, I was a songwriter or musician who surrounded himself with improvisers, because I love improvised music. And it always just seemed like a dream to me, like a kind of utopian relation to music. Before I played the guitar, I had a dream in which I was able to improvise songs on the guitar. And I don't think that I would have used the language of improvisation. I was probably 12 years old, but it was just like, it was maybe the happiest dream I ever had in my life, right? And I was always the person playing my songs in an ensemble with improvisers, because I wanted musicians to play different parts each time. But I was the person who was never comfortable as an improviser for, I don't know, 20 or so years of playing music with other people, because I always wanted to hit pause and rewind and rework a certain part. Like I was very focused on composition, which for me is primarily a process of revision. But I don't know. I mean, I blame it on the pandemic and watching a lot of movies and playing the guitar while watching movies, and that's kind of how I learned to be an improviser.
Okay, so
woodshedding.
Yeah, so film directors, David is open for scoring your movie. And writing, David. So you've written a couple of books, but you started your first book not like too, what do you say, like too far? No, what's the proper English word? Like not too recent, opposite of like not too long ago? Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
David's magic in action.
Yeah.
So how did that work? Like you've written lyrics for songs and like bands and your own projects, but then now you're also like an author. You write books.
Yeah, I got a late start on that. I was 47 years old when Records Are in the Landscape came out, and I thought that was just like, oh my God, what a terrible situation to be in. And I don't know, I was kind of doing other stuff. That book began its life as a dissertation, and all I can say is thank God I didn't try to publish it 10 years before or 15 years before, because I think it's a much better book for having been rewritten from the ground up a couple of times. I don't know, a friend who, when I first described the book is about, it's a kind of comparative study of listening cultures between experimental music in the 1960s and people listening to this music 40 years later, and just a kind of comparison between these cultures on the basis of their relation to recorded sound. So it was kind of a badge of honor in the 1960s that your experimental music couldn't adequately be represented on two 20-minute sides of an LP. And then 40 years later, people had a much less, angst-filled relation to recording, and a much more complex relation to recording. And a friend suggested that, okay, if you're writing about technologies that are going to be out of date by the time the book is published, right? I'm writing about MP3 blogs and things like that. His sort of like best case scenario was like, just make sure it's a well-written book. The subject matter can be out of date, but people will probably continue to be interested in it if the prose is good. And so, that's something that I took great pleasure with. Yeah.
When the book came out, I was really surprised. I was like, "Wow, David has written a proper book." And I really enjoyed. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it, and I had a thought, and I never shared that thought with you, but I think since we're like amongst us, and this is being recorded and streamed,
Tell me.
I hope he's not writing another book.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what? What did you say?
I hope that will be his only book. I was
yeah.
like, it's so great to write a book and then just like depart from it and
Yeah.
not write another one. And then you did write another one.
Yeah.
Why that?
Well, but I think that we're on the same wavelength here, because the next book was a book-length poem about a fictional concert of improvised music, and I had only written song lyrics before. I'd never written a poem before. And so, the first poem that I wrote is Now That the Audience is Assembled. And I remember explaining to my friend Ben Lerner, who was just beginning to write fiction, right? He was a poet and was writing a novel. And so he challenged me to write a book of poetry. And I told him, yes, that's great. Yeah, sure, I'll do that. It'll be my first poem. And I was about to say, and last poem. And before I could say it, he said, and last poem. So, yeah. So you, me, and Ben are all on the same wavelength with this, I think.
Yeah,
One and done.
You found a loophole, right? Like
Yeah.
you wrote your first book, then you published a poem, the first poem. That was also your last poem. Then you wrote
my second poem that was my last poem.
Yeah, but then the third book again is like a different thing. It's more like it's not really a biography, but it's a kind of a tour book. Is that right?
I mean, it narrates 30 years of playing music on tour, and where the first two, I would say, like one of the characteristic aspects of the first two books of poetry are they describe the events of a single evening. So like they're very, very closely described. And the final one in the series takes place over the course of 30 years. So I like this, like, like tripping forward and like you've like stumble into another year and like suddenly 5 years have passed.
Oh yeah, I skipped Voice in the Headphone.
Yeah.
So okay, tell us about the book before the final book.
Oh, it's a book about a frantic day in the recording studio as an unnamed musician is trying to finish a score for a fictional film, and the film frequently takes over the narrative.
I like how you're able to zoom like huge chunks of time, history of experimental music on record. First book, Records Ruin the Landscape, and then very like just one night in form of a poem. I like how it is also kind of the lyrics to a song that like somehow plays in your head, stops, starts again. Second book, Now That the Audience is Assembled, and then a single recording session over the course of one book, for the lack of a better word, and then a whole like 30 years kind of like condensed into a book, for the lack of a better word.
Yeah. So
of course, what's the next work about that you've been working on here?
Oh, well, you heard the beginning of it. What should I say about it? I thought that it was going to be more of a historical work about composers and musicians working in multidisciplinary settings and finding themselves composing in media that they had never expected. So Robert Ashley making operas for television, things like that. And I figured that I would I would write my way into a better knowledge of the subject by narrating my own collaborative experiences. And I think that that's, like filled the void, and that's what the book is.
So it's not only Susan Howe and Anthony McCall.
No,
there are
you're
other
in there as well.
collaborations.
So yeah. Yeah.
Let's open it up to the floor. Take questions from the audience.
Oh, so the burning questions already? Yeah. Get them out.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
protocol is raise your
Yes.
hands and then throw the question.
Isa Deng.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for this very intriguing presentation. I want to ask you a question that I want to ask every artist. Do you compose with and people have vastly different answers. Do you compose with an audience in mind? And if so, who is this audience? And if not, why not? And what are the pros and cons of creating, composing, drawing, writing with an audience in mind, especially with experimental work?
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever get mad at the crass taste of the modern audience? And all the questions. So just tell us about the audience.
Yeah. I mean, to begin with, I spend more of my life as an audience member than as a musician. So I don't see myself as inhabiting one side or other of this divide. And when I'm writing music that will be recorded for an album release, played in performance, played in different ensembles of musicians, the same composition adapted for different groupings of people, it's difficult to think of an audience just because the composition itself will be adapted to so many different contexts and so many different uses. What has been tremendously interesting to me in working primarily with visual artists for whom the disposition of the audience within an installation or an exhibition, that kind of mise en scène of audience or dramaturgy of the exhibition has been fascinating to me. So I feel like maybe I'm a little underdeveloped as a musician in my own sense of thinking of an audience, and it's one of the things that I love the most about working with artists who really are considering the flow and the experience and the attention of audience. Thank you. Nell Painter. I know all these people. I gave them these questions already. So, yes. All right. Read your question, Nell.
You didn't give me this one because it's really a dumb question.
Right.
We're such a smart. It's absolutely fascinating. My usual partner in asking questions here, Peter, is not going to ask a question, so I have to ask the question.
Oh, right. He's banned. Ask a question. Yeah.
But this is about how you might feel or experience a tension between what is playful and what is original and what sort of comes out of doing the work and the planning. I mean, I think the word composer means that there's a lot of planning that goes on. But I want to ask about two little pieces of planning that I saw, and I want to ask you about them. One is the pencils that your collaborator used in those drawings. Those are very special, soft pencils.
Mm-hmm.
So something's going on there in the hand and the image making that I'd like to ask you about. And the other thing is that you showed us what is obviously a book because it has page numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Why does your book have page numbers?
Okay, so two answers. One, Anthony McCall, even though he kind of like draws at the speed of thought, the diagrams or schema are also drawings, and the day books that he's used for decades, and that he recently scanned. I mean, just like incredible treasure trove awaiting publication or access. There's simultaneously compositions, notes, aids memoir, and drawings as well. Yeah, so high kind of aesthetic investment in those. Secondly, so what I showed were 4-page spreads from Susan Howe's book, That This. And I should have said it beforehand. The images are from the photographer James Welling, who may have been a fellow here. But anyway, yeah, it's a book that was published by New Directions in 2011. So, yeah. But that's a good question. Anybody else?
Hi, thank you for this. It was great. This is a simple question, but I'm wondering, to what extent do you think about what you're doing with collaboration as a kind of translation, or if you're resisting that way of thinking about accompanying these other art forms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the way in which that makes sense to me, like the way that it really like resonates with me, is not so much that art forms or disciplines, right, are so coherent that you can have a translation from sculpture to music. Like in fact, Anthony's drawing where the sound or the image disappears and it's replaced by a sound, I think that we kind of proved that like this is a fool's errand. It's a beautiful idea, this kind of reciprocity of sound and image, but I just can't really ever imagine it functioning like that. But the way in which I do think about translation is in the teaching that I do. So I teach in an interdisciplinary performance and interactive media arts program where students they might come from a background as a choreographer or as a theater director or making performance art from a visual arts context or doing interactive programming. And the translation that I have to do and the thing that I feel like I really enjoy, there are lots of things that I really enjoy about the teaching, but translating from the kind of, best do I describe it? Just the kind of like nuts and bolts modes of production of these different traditions. So like frequently I'm working with students who come from an experimental theater background and students who come from a performance art background, and they're working on the same project and they have a similar kind of vision, but just their way of producing that work as a live performance differs so significantly, like they don't have the same vocabulary and different ways of producing work. And so I think that a lot of what I do in the role of teacher is translate between the vocabularies of different disciplines. And that's very interesting to me. Being somebody who's always wanted to speak multiple languages well, and as a person who doesn't speak multiple languages well, at least I speak multiple languages of art making. Mona.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
One current in your work, which is not even on the surface so much, perhaps I'm reading into it, but I don't think so, is sort of an element of resurrection. I happen to be, my table partner tonight told me that your collaboration with Howe started in a moment of perhaps she was a bit blocked, and you sort of gave her work a second life. And in your collaboration with the piece, like the beautiful piece some of us heard last night, which involved some of the archival material of Ferrari, there too, I'm assuming she was at an older point of her life, and there's just a sort of I don't know, there's a fictional element of this younger artist coming to these older artists, and I'm having this beautiful resurrection of their work, or not resurrection, that's the wrong word, but celebration really, and collaboration. And I guess I'm wondering, for me, fictionally, I'm just curious as like the very first moment, like did you get in touch with How, or how did you how did that come about in the very first place?
Yeah, in the very first place, we were commissioned to make performance work by the Fondation Cartier in Paris.
So someone else.
Yeah.
You were fixed up more or less.
It was it was
Fascinating.
it was an invitation. But I will say I'm not sure if I've subscribed to that reading that Susan was in some sort of crisis in her composition. And yeah, I don't even know about that. I feel like that's another conversation, but I wouldn't, without getting into a deeper conversation about it, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. But that said, I do love working intergenerationally. I don't know. Susan Howe's the same age as my father. My mother's name is Susan, and there's something about. Yeah, there is something about these older women. Yeah, Brunhild Ferrari, I think, is the same age. Yeah, no, but the incredible generosity of these older women who trust me with their material. I mean, I think that at first, in working with Susan, it was interesting going back to the recordings, and I feel like I was less cautious and hesitant and overly respectful with the material. So, for instance, in Thoreau, there are some sections where she doesn't have this technique of superimposing the text, but in the piece that I made, there is superimposition of text. And I was listening back to it in thinking about this book and thinking like, oh, this is good. Like I was not too cautious and too respectful from the start, which had been my fear. Yeah. Yes, Luke.
David. When we collaborated together in New York, we had to do this discussion, and I think one of the things that I asked you was about how an old punk rocker got so interested in musique concrète, and I think you kind of, the talk today has really kind of illuminated to me how, you'd been leaving this breadcrumb trail for many, many decades through discussions that you had and your love of art in its kind of multiple forms. So I suppose it made me think about this quote that Anne Carson said that was, art is something that we enjoy as we put up with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wonder whether, I also noticed I think the first time we met that you were a consummate note taker. And you also said that you had an incredible a photographic memory.
No. No. That's why I take notes, because I have a decent memory, but no, I take a lot of notes.
I suppose my question is about whether you really ever imagined that you would be working with artists from those early kind of punk rock days.
Yeah, I mean the early punk rock days lasted the blink of an eye. It's interesting, this category of like old punk rocker, because it would be one thing if I had a mohawk and we're still playing the music that I played when I was 19 when I didn't have a mohawk. Punk for me was the authorizing impulse for making work in the first place. But as a kind of stylistic reference point, a year, 2 years, I don't know. You get tagged with these things. I feel like today I do what I always thought that I would do without having thought with great specificity about what that would be, which is rather that I would allow myself to follow my nose and work with people whom I really adore.
I don't have a question, but I'm going to move the evening along here. And thank you both for the wonderful discussion. And I'll ask Jan to come down and we'll do the proverbial seventh inning stretch here at the American Academy. And then David will perform.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.